Welcome, welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I'm Dr. Shaunna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns, and I am here with Dr. Lisa. How goes it? And are you ready to dive into some cool topics today?
I am ready. Hi, everyone. My pronouns are she, hers. I'm excited for this week's episode. We got some good discussion topics for you all. And I'm also excited that we are. I'm not excited that it's the end of May, but I am excited that the end of May is bringing drier, sunnier, less volatile weather.
Amen. Look, I hope so. I'm knocking on my desk right now, like, good luck, good luck. I hope so. I hope so. Oh, absolutely. So I'm with you on that. So we're tipping off, getting closer and closer to real summer. Hopefully, I don't know. We'll see. But Lisa, help us to dive into the word of the week, since we're
Mm-hmm.
we're going to dovetail into this quite a bit today.
We
I'm just
are.
now realizing it, how
Yep.
much we're going to dive into the word of the week. So go for it.
Yeah, so this week we wanted to define gender, or more specifically, gender identity and gender expression. We've talked about gender and how it is a socially constructed construct. Socially constructed construct. That seems repetitious, but we have talked about that before, but it might have been a while. And for new listeners, we wanted to recap. So, when we're thinking about gender, right? Gender is something that happens on a spectrum. It is not just two genders, men and women. There are more than that in our culture and our society. And so the two key terms you're going to hear a lot with discussions of gender are gender identity and gender expression. So gender identity is defined as the internal sense of self. So the internal identification of your own gender. And this may or may not match the biological sex that you were assigned at birth, right? So when someone is born, they are assigned either male or female, and in some cases intersex. And it is assumed that therefore, if you're assigned male, you will identify your gender as man. And if you're assigned female, you will identify your gender as woman. And that is not necessarily the case. And so there's sometimes a disconnect between those two pieces. Gender expression is how you then choose to express your gender identity. And so you can have an internal sense of your gender identity, and then you can choose to express that in a way that might be congruent, culturally congruent with that gender identity, or maybe you are going to play with the ways in which we understand gender and gender expression, and so you are presenting in a different way that may or may not be the same as the gender identity that you have. So they're not the same thing. So I guess ultimately we want our listeners to understand that gender is not a binary. Gender identity is an internal sense of your own gender, and gender expression is how you choose to then express that internal sense. And they don't always match, and they don't always match with that biological sex that you were assigned at birth.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. I only would add to that great definition of both, is that, again, with our systems thinking lens, we realize that there's a lot of systems that don't want to allow people to identify as they so choose. And so, as that continues to be a pressing issue, continue to, again, push down sometimes push down your proclivity to exercise your privilege of attempting to assign a gender identity to someone that may not be accurate. Stay open to what their gender identity is professed to be, what it is stated, but you don't get to exercise your privilege and put labels. I always think about you. You remember those label makers, Lisa, where you could make a label and you could put it on things around your house? Like, I think we do that to people all the time. Like, I'm printing out a label and I'm putting it on you, and I don't care if
Yes.
it
Yes.
jives with
Yeah.
how you feel. I don't care about that. And so
Yeah. Yeah.
that's what I would encourage us not to do. Don't pull out your label maker and start putting labels on people that are not accurate and are offensive and hurtful, So but let's get into phase one. Look, y'all, 100 years ago, Shauna was a Girl Scout. Can y'all believe that? I was a Girl Scout for 7 years. I started as a junior Girl Scout in the Presbyterian church in my hometown, downtown. And we had our Girl Scout troop that would gather there. I immediately, once I got up to the level of cadet, I immediately quit when camping was involved. Okay. No, don't do camping. All right. I love Girl Scouts, but once camping was a requirement of the troop, that was it for Shaunna. Okay. But let me bring us forward 100 years to where we are now. So, Boy Scouts of America is renaming themselves as Scouting of America, right? Or Scouting America, rather. And so, what I think is really important for people to think about is just a few things that are in the backdrop of this change. The first thing is that the naming is current, but the change to allow girls to participate in their organization happened in 2017. Okay, so really at this point, we're trying to make sure that the name of the organization is parallel to its membership, Scouting of America. Now, what I think is interesting is, again, as we think about this history, 5 years ago, Boy Scouts opened its programs to girls after allowing LGBT youth back in 2013, and also gay scout leaders in 2015. But let's be clear on what's going on. In addition to these identity conversations, we have to be clear about the business piece of this, because Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts have been businesses for many, many years. Don't even ask me how many boxes of cookies I've sold in my lifetime, y'all. Just stop trying to count. Okay. So, given that, what I think is interesting about the business background of Boy Scouts of America, now Scouting America, is that they emerged from bankruptcy just last year after having over 80,000 lawsuits from people sexually assaulted by scout leaders as children, right? So, there's a lot of mess going on there, Lisa. I think what's really interesting, it kind of reminds me, and forgive me, y'all, for harkening back to higher ed, but it kind of reminds me of schools and colleges and universities that I've followed over the years that were single gender that opened up to be co-ed colleges and universities because of the financial piece that they could not afford to remain a single gender organization. Not even talking about the lawsuits and everything else, but they could not afford to be single gender, and so they opened it up. Exponentially increased the number of members, and therefore that directly affected the bottom line and its ability to stay afloat. So I don't know if that's part of it, regardless of the lawsuits, but we know the lawsuits ain't helping, right? They're not helping in the situation. So, what do you think about this
No.
recent renaming and all this drama in the background?
I love it. I mean, I think it's about time. I think it's hilarious the ways in which particularly conservative pundits and legislators have accused Boy Scouts of going woke and nothing is sacred and there's no spaces for boys, which is just ludicrous because the whole world is designed for boys and men, right? So that always just makes me smile. And, there what's so funny about it is all of the resistance to this and is ignoring that piece that you just articulated about the fact that they are emerging from bankruptcy. They have very real financial struggles, and the reason why they have very real financial struggles is because their scout leaders, like, pervasive systemic abuse existed in their organization, right? But, conservative pundits don't mention that, right? When they're talking about the morality of the Boy Scouts and how important it is, blah, 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 despite the fact that many a Boy Scout has been harmed, like irreversibly harmed by the experience that they had of sex abuse. And so I think it's a good move. I know that they have also been trying to articulate a stronger message of inclusion. And so it's very hard to do that if you're only admitting or allowing one gender into your organization. The other thing I think is really interesting is when we think about Boy Scouts and we think about the ways in which activities are created for boys vis-a-vis girls, boys' activities tend to focus on leadership and strength and other kind of stereotypical masculine traits that are often absent from kind of comparable girls' organizations, right? And that just further entrenches these ideas of gender and that boys can do these things and girls can do those things and they shouldn't mix. So, thinking about how we talked about gender at the top of the show, right? I think it's an important way of also continuing to pull girls into and give them skills and experience that have historically been only given to boys, right? So I think there's also this larger piece there that is going to be really good for the development of children of all genders.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and absolutely, I agree 100%. And here's the thing. So I found the number, Lisa, since I'm all about being under the hood with the numbers and what's going on from that business background piece. So at based on PBS NewsHour, okay? Based on PBS NewsHour and a interview that they conducted, um, this change, all of these changes are coming at that point of bankruptcy, Lisa, where Boy Scouts of America is paying out or has paid out more than 2 billion with a B, $1 billion to men who say they were sexually abused as scouts. So, of course, we know what that means. That means membership numbers are going to go down. Right now, they have a little over 1 million members, but that also includes the 176,000 or so girls and young women. That includes that number, and the number is still dwindling. So that tells you a lot about the reputation of Boy Scouts and what they will need to do to continue to heal and apologize and do lots of things to create psychologically safe spaces for people and their families that want to participate in scouting. So they have a lot of work to do. But I think what's also very interesting and telling, Lisa, is that when I saw the headline of the name change, my first thought, not knowing a lot of the background until we did a little bit of research and study here, my first thought, selfishly, a little bit biased, was that, oh Lord, are they going to change the name of Girl Scouts? Is there a merger going on? Like, what might happen to Girl Scouts of America? Those were my thoughts, or at least my train of thought. Well, nothing. Nothing's going to change with Girl Scouts. A whole lot of nothing is going to happen with Girl Scouts of America because I did not understand the depths to which the the disagreement, the friction, the lack of uh, amicable relationship was had between Boy Scouts of America and Girl Scouts of America. They've never gotten along. Never. They've never gotten along. And so what I think is interesting is that, based on the numbers, it doesn't look as if Girl Scouts of America's numbers have gone down despite Boy Scouts of America trying to salvage something here. So I think that's very interesting. Girl Scouts of America has always been a single sex movement. It was started in 1909. So, Juliette Lowe founded the Girl Scouts. I do remember all of that back from my days. Um, and so, given that, I think what's really interesting is now girls have these two options, at least, at the very least, these two separate options. And some may feel comfortable with one or the other. Now, I kind of feel like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It's like, how many options are enough for women? All of them. All of them. That's how many. Because historically, we're trying to correct, right? And so, I think this is going to be a fascinating rollout. I'm going to keep following the story, Lisa, because again, I want to continue to see girls really prosper in places where they can be planted and safe and develop over time. The next question, Lisa, that I know you and I are both asking is, okay, in addition to that 2 billion, what systems are being put in place so scout leaders can't do some of the heinous, ridiculous things that they've done in the past to kids? That's my next question, is what are we doing to protect kids? So kind of like Lisa, in endurance sport or in K through 12 sport, what's the safe sport version for scouting? I hope they have something up their sleeve because they need something systemically to be put in place so that such ridiculous behavior is the outlier and not the norm, like it seems to have been historically in Boy
Yeah.
Scouts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they're on that to the degree, the quality of being on that. I don't know, but I was curious as you were talking about Girl Scouts and what their inclusivity policy is, and I just did a quick Google search, and so I think I've always understood the Girl Scouts to be more inclusive and more progressive than Boy Scouts just in general, right? And maybe that's the source of some of that friction you mentioned, but they do it said their rules say that they welcome all girls to join the Girl Scout movement, regardless of gender assigned at birth or sexual orientation. Additionally, there will be no rules that single out girls based on their gender assigned at birth, gender identity, or sexuality. So they are inclusive of trans youth, non-binary youth, intersex youth, right? They're not making that distinction. And I do think it's interesting that the Boy Scouts may have wanted to merge with, or maybe the Boy Scouts wanted Girl Scouts to merge with them, but Girl Scouts being like, no, you are riddled with this heinous activity and behavior, and you're coming out of bankruptcy, and we're a solid and progressive organization, so no, thank you. Right? That feels good to me.
Thanks, but no thanks, right? Thanks, but no thanks. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 Uh, all right, Lisa, take us into phase two here.
All right, all right. So phase two. So I was reading an article in the New York Times related to memory. So the larger discussion I want to have is about memory and how our memory affects our commitment to social justice, racial justice, or kind of sympathy, empathy for, right? So this article was a New York Times Siena poll. They called 1,000 people, representative sample nationally, and asked them what they remembered about the Trump administration, right? So what are your memories of the Trump administration? And so they also asked their affiliation. And based on a person's affiliation, so Trump supporter or Biden supporter, the memory of the Trump administration was like diametrically opposed. So one example, Trump supporters would say, I remember Trump's honesty. And Biden supporters would say, I remember Trump's lies, right? So, and then interestingly, only 5% of the folks that were surveyed cited a memory of January 6th of something out of Trump's presidency, and 4% cited COVID. So it's like, yeah. So it's like of this group of people that they surveyed, the kind of two massive, massive things that came out of the Trump presidency were only mentioned as something that people remembered by a tiny number of people in that survey, right? So that just got me to thinking about how are our memories shaped over time? Whether we are personally invested in something, whether it happens to us, happens to someone we know, whether we observe it as a bystander, how is that shaping our memory of things? And then, in relation to DEI, we talked last week about the renaming of those Virginia schools, the fact that that is now going backwards, right? We talked about the fact that the kind of racial reckoning that happened with George Floyd's murder has the fervor with which people were looking to change has kind of dulled, shall we say, over time, right? And so, how is memory affecting that? How is our individual and collective memories of George Floyd's murder and the fact that it's no longer a recent event changing the way that we now think about racial justice, social justice, protests around that? I just thought was an interesting discussion to have because there's this concept called recency bias, which means we are more likely to make decisions and think about things in the moment, right? So current events. So this really bad thing could have happened 10 years ago and it could have been monumental. Well, let's not even go back that far. Let's say COVID, pretty monumental, right? But now, because COVID is not a thing right now in front of us, we're more concerned about gas prices because gas prices are high. But gas prices are high as like a ripple effect of COVID, right? Anyway, so I was just wondering what you're thinking about that and how we shift and manipulate and remember or don't remember.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've got me thinking now about, I appreciate what you said about recency bias. And at the same time, what does that bias look like when and if you are a person that's directly harmed by whatever's happening, right? So I'm thinking about, you're right. Yeah, there are things where it's like, oh, that recently happened for me, so I remember it more vividly. I feel a certain type of way. But again, recency bias, let me work this out here in my brain. Recency bias, I wonder if it lands differently if it squarely affected you. So let's say, for example, knock on wood, God forbid, let's say, Lisa, you and I both are a similar age. We both go through the pandemic, but you have someone very close to you personally affected and pass away from COVID. Your memory may be much sharper about COVID because it directly affected you and rearranged your entire family, your family system function, everything, compared to me, where I was kind of in it, but yet a bystander because I wasn't directly affected for the long term by it. So it's no longer recent to me anymore because it's no longer my lived experience. Or if that bias piece is based on how much direct harm I receive. So I'll give you a great example. I hear people all the time, and I often get concerned about my boys around this. People who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, they might not have had a word to describe it called bullying, but they remember people who said certain things to them, who did certain things to them, who harmed them in a certain way. Like, I still remember the names of teachers that told me that I probably wouldn't be successful in college. And so you probably should go to a vocational school at that time because we don't think you're going to be successful. I remember their exact names. 46 years old, y'all. We shouldn't care anymore about those individuals. But what I'm saying is that it's not wiped away from my memory. I remember those conversations like they were yesterday. And so what I'm saying as it relates to this whole 45 example of this, well, I'm probably hearkening back to my hometown, Lisa, unfortunately, is that only 4% cited COVID in this particular poll. Well, I'm thinking about the people that still feel like COVID wasn't real and that it was a hoax and that it didn't really directly affect them. And so if you think something is a figment of someone's imagination, then you're not going to remember it or bring it up because you're still in denial that it even exists. So, given that, I'm like, oh, this is very interesting because all of these overlays around our memory, how do we experience it? How do we experience it? So, another great example that we brought up, as I was thinking about the intergenerational piece that we talked about during last week's pod, I have a friend of mine who is a native New Yorker, and she's around about the same age as my little cohort group. All of us lived through 9/11, but yet her experience probably would be more of a recency bias in her mind because she had two very close friends that she lost in the Twin Towers. Her experience of 9/11 is going to be completely different from me, who I still remember and I still know how it inconveniences us on planes to this day and all those other things. But I was watching on a TV. She didn't get an answer to her friend's phone calls. See what I'm saying? The experience is quite different, and so I wonder how that also affects people too. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's I think it's, people say it's a figment of your imagination. I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
it depends on how close you are to it, though.
Yeah. I think that's a key factor here. Our memory of something and how pertinent it is to us is obviously
Hmm.
connected to the proximity that we have to that something, right? Now, if you were to ask people, what do you remember about George Bush Jr.'s presidency, right? If we were to ask the same question, how many of those people would say 9/11, right? Or how many of them would say the war in Iraq? Or how many of them would say strong economy? I don't know, right? And probably the degree to
The
which you
shoe.
choose. Yeah, yeah,
Whoever threw the
right?
shoe at him.
But some people might be like airplane restrictions, right? So they might not name
Yes, yes.
9/11, which was the reason for the airplane restrictions, but those airplane restrictions still exist. And
Hmm.
so that's where that recency piece would come in, even though they may have lost someone in 9/11, because 9/11 was so long ago now, what they're still living with and experiencing daily is the airplane restrictions, right? Like that's a much more prevalent. They may still have grief, right, and loss, but it is going to not feel the same way as it would have done in October 2001, right? So yeah, so the thing with George Floyd's murder, I mean, outside of the his family and friends and the people that were around him when he was murdered and were videoing it, those people who were very close bystanders, right, and very deeply impacted by it. Everyone else was watching this on TV or on the internet. So how is our memory of that continuing to push us forward in racial justice and social justice, or not, because it now happened a while ago and I'm now more concerned with gas prices, right?
Well, it's conflating in my mind because so memory in regard to that moment. So I still feel very strongly that the US is built upon this foundation of winners and losers.
Mm,
And with
okay.
that, the winners and losers piece is big in that, we talked about this before. We've talked about it on many podcasts before. In this country specifically, I still feel very strongly that anyone that is still in support of the Confederacy and what they were trying to do then, and fast forwarding now, there's this memory that we're still pissed off that we lost and that we were
Mm,
on the right side of history at that time. And we still
mm-hmm,
think we're on the right side of history. And so even when it comes to, presidents, presidential elections, any of that, and it doesn't even have to be a presidential election. It can be a George Floyd. It can be a Freddie Gray. It can be fill in the blank of all of the issues that specifically happened in 2020 alone. There are individuals that still feel wronged. There has been no attempt to make what was wrong right by the folks that did the wrong, so therefore they're holding on to it. And I can't say that I blame that. So, you know, given that there's still people that are in the movement for Black Lives Matter, they still see murders happen all over this country that may not have been caught on someone's iPhone, but they're experiencing Groundhog Day over and over quite readily. It just happens to not be public. And it also happens to not be in the middle of a pandemic where everyone's still enough to pay attention to what was always going on. Then, of course, the memory is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a little bit different. Um, and I think, again, making what's wrong right has oftentimes not been the priority. It's been the get over it, get
mm-hmm,
over it, get over everything,
mm-hmm.
get over slavery, get over it, get over the women's suffrage movement, get over it, get over it, get over it. It's like, wait a minute, you don't get a pass. Like, I don't care if, Lisa,
Mm-hmm.
you and I waved our magic wand and we had pay equity, we had all types of gender equity. That's still skipping over the step of admitting that one was wrong from the get-go. And I don't think that will happen for a lot of identity groups in this country because we suck at apologizing in this country. I mean, even Germany does it better than we do. And that's saying something. So we don't apologize well. We just think, let's just step right over it. I remember that meme the year, Lisa, that Biden officially declared Juneteenth a federal holiday. And so it was like this staircase where this guy was stepping over. So he was going from like the bottom step up to like the fifth step in one step, saying, here we are, here's where we were. Juneteenth is 5 steps ahead, but let's, step over reparations. Let's step over an apology. Let's step over, civil rights movement. Let's just step over all these other things and jump to a holiday. And it's like, wait a minute. Thank you. However, go back and apologize publicly on behalf of this entire country. So we may never get those apologies.
Yeah, and I know we're at the end of this phase, but that just opens up this idea of public memory and
Yeah.
how that operates en masse to deny groups of people the apologies or the reparations that they deserve, right? Because if we as a
Mm-hmm.
society step over that memory, or we ban books, right? Or we say you can't teach about this in school, which is altering memories, right? Like that's what it's doing.
Oh, yes.
then
Mhm.
that public memory is weaponized almost to
Mhm.
push back on any kind of apology, because to apologize means you have to remember, and we don't want to remember it that way collectively, right?
So are we so the big question that we probably won't answer in this phase or podcast um, is there an entire system that is making sure that they turn our memory into propaganda about what has and will happen?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think so, right? Because I think memory is also integrated with political opinion or just opinion, right? And where you
Mhm.
fall on that, then you remember things differently. The one exception is probably if you are physically impacted, right, in the way that memory is stored in the body.
Right, right,
That
right.
probably
Yes.
overrides like political affiliation or something like that. But yeah,
Mhm.
I think there is. I think there's a machine, there's a system that
Mhm.
is intentional in how
Yeah.
it's trying to cover up, paper
Mhm.
over certain
Mhm.
truths. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, y'all. Again,
All right.
lots of questions and no answers, but let me just guide
Right.
us into phase three. We have talked more than once about that concept of vocational awe, and me and Dr. Lisa getting t-shirts and sweatshirts with exploitation across the front of them, y'all, because we feel so strongly about this concept here. But academic librarian Fabazi Atari, her last name is spelled Ettarh. Uh, she wrote this article that coined the phrase vocational awe, which we've mentioned before in this podcast, which she is a librarian and she's talking about her own industry and area, the ways in which the institution of librarianship has come to be thought of as this inherently good, sacred institution, and therefore it's beyond critique in many ways. So, therefore, this becomes a breeding ground for exploitation, where academic librarians who get master's degrees in library science, for example, are paid pennies because, well, this is a bastion of values. Education is this place to be worshiped, if you will. And I'm a big fan of education, but not to exploit people. And so, given that, Lisa and I have done a lot of work in thinking around how do we apply vocational awe to lots of different places, including our own previous industry of higher education. And so, more recently, we've worked with clients that are all in religious spaces and places. And exactly what Lisa and I have been kind of ruminating on was happening in that work, where it was emerging as we were doing some organizational development work. It was emerging that some staff, some individuals within the organization, significant enough to name, uh, they mentioned that there were no, for example, clear career paths, or it's hard to even figure out what to do to get a promotion, or how in the world do you get a raise here? I've been here for 10 years and I haven't gotten a dollar more than I had before, that type of thing. And I started thinking about this, Lisa, as we were talking. This was a pretty large organization with very large bank accounts. And I'm standing there thinking to myself, this is vocational awe. And let's add another layer of identity on top of it. Not only is it vocational awe in that particular industry, which happened to be nonprofit work, but it was another layer of identity in regards to being directly affiliated with religious work, right? And so I'm thinking to myself, absolutely. I've spent my entire livelihood being born and raised in the Baptist church, being ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, after seminary, working within the United Methodist Church, going to a Mennonite seminary, you name it. I've been in, around, and about a number of different Christian denominations, and I've also witnessed friends in other religious traditions. And the very same song is singing, Lisa, when it comes to not only should you be grateful for this job, but you should be humbled that this is the work of your faith tradition, of your theology, in particular Christian faith traditions. It's the Lord's work. And so, how dare you, again, vilification, how dare you ask for another penny? I don't care if you got a doctorate. I don't care if you have 10 more years experience. I don't care if you got a certificate. I don't care if you went through a special training. You should be ashamed of yourself for expecting more money or a bigger title or more responsibility. And again, this tool, how religion is used as a tool of exploitation. I know that seems like core Shauna. But when it comes to not just service and volunteerism, but the place where you go as your bread and butter that pays your bills, I'm sorry, y'all, but Baltimore Gas and Electric, where I pay my electric bill, does not care that I may work for a religious institution. They want their money. The cost of living is going up. Everybody wants their money. You just mentioned gas prices are going up. You don't get a special discount on your gas because you work for the Church of XYZ. You don't, not in this world. And so, I grew up in a time where what was called then prosperity teaching and preaching was extremely vilified, um, because it was seen as just do the best as you can with as little as you can, and it was vilified to want more. And part of me, especially in the Black community, makes me think that that was part of the remnants of enslavement, flat out. I got to keep y'all under control. So how dare you want more than your masters would? How dare you? And that's trickled out into all of society, including where we are today. And so it's problematic. I was very much in my feelings as I was thinking about vocational awe and religious work, particularly, Lisa. So anyway, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense why it would apply in that context to me, particularly with that refrain, it's the Lord's work, right? As though you don't, yeah, like you don't need to pay your electricity bills because, so, like, the Lord is going to do that. No. But it's also interesting to me, and I think this is broader than religious organizations, but it applies, right? When we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and we think about some of these nonprofits, we think about religious nonprofits whose central mission is to help others create equity, create a more inclusive XYZ, right? And then while at the same time, kind of articulating this internal message that if you want that for yourself as an employee of the organization, then there's something wrong with you. You're ungrateful, right? Like, how dare you ask for that? The work should be enough. So it's this real tension that exists between the narrative or the external messaging about what it is that the organization is designed to do, and then that same narrative or messaging is not applied internally to the staff and employees. And I see that being particularly salient within a religious organization when we think just broadly some principles of Christianity and other faith traditions are to support people who have less than you, right? Like to work for the good of all, kind of some of those kind of broad stroke messages, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that tension of how dare you, so, having conversations about the basic needs of individuals, but yet you're saying that you want more. Um, I still think it's very much exploitation, and it's connected to our conversations about the nonprofit industrial complex and how it's this uh, machine that benefits from individuals not being well off because it creates an opportunity to serve. And that opportunity to serve then brings in people who have a heart for service, and do not have a heart for asking for more. And then you wonder why there's a revolving door and people continue leaving for more. That is just mind blowing to me. So I think that's something important to mention. And I also think too, and I can't remember if we've talked about this before, um, having those conversations, what hit me, Lisa, and we can read body language pretty well when we're facilitating with a group or what have you. So having a conversation about nonprofit industrial complex is one link in the chain. Then adding the vocational awe to that work happens to be religious, and then you tack on the freedom dreaming piece of that, where could you sit there in your nonprofit work and envision a world where your work was not necessary because we solved the problem that you've been striving to solve for your entire career. So their brain couldn't go there. And part of the reason why their brain couldn't go there was because they're so entrenched in the work, and it's great work. I mean, phenomenal work. But at the same time, they benefit from being able to do the work. So what happens when the problem is eliminated and you no longer have the work, right? So, you know, when I first started in DEI work many years ago, I remember being on my interview with Dean Rucker, who now works at the University of Virginia, and he interviewed me and asked me why I wanted the job. And I said, well, these are the reasons why I want the job. But frankly, in my lifetime, I would love to work myself out of this job because it's not necessary to exist anymore because we've solved the problem. Those individuals could not envision a world where the problem wasn't there. And so that's when we go from the branch of the work down into the root of the justice of, are we solving the deep root problem, or are we just putting a band-aid over the problem? And we benefit from producing band-aids. It's like we benefit, like, if there's no problem, like, we got to keep the root problem in place because we need the branch so that we can continue to put a band-aid on it, or else we're useless. What?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
That's
I think that's that.
exploitation.
Yeah, it's exploitation. It's absolutely happening. The degree to which people who work in these organizations understand that, though, I don't know, because to talk about it is to be
Mm.
disruptive. I mean, going back to that intergenerational conversation around who's the disruptor and who's not, right? And kind of getting straight to the root of it, like that kind of analysis from a younger person in an organization, religious or otherwise, would probably be quite challenging for an older person who has been kind of churning away in that system and thinks that it's righteous and thinks that it's problematic to ask for more money. I mean, gosh, I remember my first like higher ed job. Like I negotiated for a little bit more money. It wasn't that much, but I remember being told after the fact that one of the two people I negotiated with doesn't like it when people negotiate. There's a gender piece to that too, but it's also around these are highly coveted positions. You should be grateful that you're getting offered the job and you should just take what you want to take, right? And that doesn't get questioned. And if you question it, then you're difficult or, aggressive, particularly women who are questioning it. And that same system then exists in the example that you gave in religious organizations where those religious organizations benefit from the sustaining of that particular problem that they're trying to solve.
Oh, absolutely. And if you're specifically talking about a religious organization that happens to be Christian, then there's a bazillion scriptures that you can pull in order to justify that exploitation. There's Matthew 26:11, the poor will always be among us. That's been the excuse since day one, that the poor will always be among us. That doesn't mean ignore the less fortunate or not do the work. But what it's in context, what it's saying is, don't lose your sensitivity to those who have less. Don't stop doing work. It doesn't mean be a martyr. That's not what it's saying. It's saying don't lose your sensitivity to those who are around you. I don't care how much money you have. If you walk down the street and your acuity doesn't pick up on the fact that someone that is houseless in that area is sleeping in a park, I don't want you to not see that. That's what the scripture is calling for. And so I think that's, it's a great tool, and I know that I'm using my lens of, Lisa, did you know that there was a particular Black Bible that excluded lots of scripture on freedom so that enslaved Blacks would not want to flee? I mean, it's literally like, you remember, when you watch it on the movies where there's like censorship, where there's like a letter and then there's like sentences that are blacked out or whatever. That's what it reminds me of. I've seen it. I've held one. It's very real. And so I always think about what is in context in scripture and then what is not intentionally, in order to what? Exploitation t-shirt, in order to exploit people, in order to control, power and control. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's everywhere. And I would imagine, and I've read more often than not that that's also the case for not just Christian, scripture, but many other holy writing,
Right.
which again makes me question power and exploitation.
Yeah, and then to bring that up vilifies you, right? Like it's just not, just don't
Right.
do that because that makes you the bad person, right? Versus calling out an injustice in a system of injustices that you're trying to fix. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
oh dear,
Mhm.
that's a lot.
Yeah. Well, and and the last piece I'll say is just being torn that because I understand the feeling of younger people in organizations that have been encouraged to speak up. It is an interesting dynamic too, where you're in the problematic system naming the problems of it. So it's like, at least it's like
Right.
you and I jumping into that pool and saying, we got to
Yeah.
be in the pool, but we know it's too much chlorine in this damn thing. Like, we got to be in it to even find that out,
Yeah.
much less do anything about it. I think that's the conundrum for a lot of people. How do you stay in it, which gives you a better chance of positive, inclusive, equitable change while still critiquing what you're in
Yeah.
without being
Yeah.
vilified is the problem. So, yeah.
Right. Exactly.
You're
Yeah.
the enemy for speaking up. Shame on you.
Uh-huh.
So, yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's a wrap for this week. So, Shauna, where can folks find us?
Oh, everywhere. They can find us everywhere with the exploitation sweatshirt on, right? So you can find us at you can find us on YouTube at Unfazed, Unedited, Apple Podcasts. Please just go ahead and follow us, subscribe there. Apple Podcasts and Spotify, Instagram, LinkedIn is usually where you can find some of the articles that connect back to our podcast each week, our episodes. Email us info@unfazedpodcast.com. If you have a question or a word you'd like us to help you to define, we can do that. And of course, you can find everything related to the Unfazed podcast at unfazedpodcast.com, where you can find old and new shows and share with your friends, your coworkers, or others in this phase of your life. Until next time.
See you next time.